Do you rely on science? Do you understand that evidence-based fact is real? Or do you let the words of others guide you? Like perhaps the clergy at your church or the media. Can you be led away from fact? In the USA, it is very apparent. Science and fact being attacked from all angles by those with an agenda. A religious agenda or a media agenda. The current president of the US acknowledges the threat himself.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
My name is Lynn Margulis. I've been doing science every day since I was about 16 years old. I teach at the University of Massachusetts. I have a PhD in genetics. In 1999, I was a recipient of the President's Medal of Science from Clinton, and I received the Da Vinci Award, that is the membership in the Da Vinci Society. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely.
According to USGS, they found as much as 6% of the World Trade Center dust consisted of tiny, previously molten iron spheres. What does this tell us about the temperatures generated in the tower's destruction?
My name is Adam Parrott, and I have a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Queen's University. I've been working for an environmental consulting firm for a number of years. When the USGS collected samples of the World Trade Center dust, they found the iron microspheres. Insofar, the USGS does not have a valid explanation for the presence of these iron microspheres.
I'm Jerry Lobdell. I'm a retired physicist and chemical engineer. I have a BS in chemical engineering from Texas Tech, and I have extensive coursework in mathematics and physics from the University of Texas at Austin. I've had broad experience in analysis and applied research, 30-year professional history spanning physics, chemical engineering, statistical analysis and modeling, and operations research. So what do the microspheres contain? Iron is the main element, and then it has smaller portions of aluminum, sulfur, a trace of manganese, a trace of potassium. Most of them are less than about a tenth of an inch in diameter, and they're spherical. And they're found in all of the dust blown out of the buildings during collapse, no matter where in Manhattan that dust is picked up.
I'm David Gregg. I have a master's and PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Illinois. Afterwards, I went to work for Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, where I worked there for more than 30 years. You cannot get a flame hot enough to start the metal to molten, make it molten in the first place so that this other process takes off. I don't know of any mechanism for that. The only way that's known that a carbonaceous material can cause steel or iron oxide to turn into a molten metal is in a blast furnace. Yeah, and that's very different than what we had.
I'm Kathy McGrade. I have a bachelor's in metallurgical engineering from New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, which I got in 1979. I then spent the next 30 years with 3 startup companies. In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel. And yet we have evidence of molten iron in the microspheres, in the rubble pile, and the metal pouring out of the side of the tower.
We could have filled up the Twin Towers with jet fuel and burned it all up, and that does not cause a fire hot enough to melt structural steel.
You must have had a much hotter heat source for you to get 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit in order to melt the steel, melt the iron, to get these spheres, these molten spheres. Your heat source must be something like a chemical reaction, an exothermic chemical reaction that reacts, in the case of thermite, reacts at 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel.
My name is Mark Basile. I'm a chemical engineer. I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. I've worked for about 25 years in industry, and the majority of what I do is analytical work and figuring out what materials are composed of, why they are what they are, why they do what they do. But I've independently seen thermitic activity within 2 separate independent samples of World Trade Center dust.
In the World Trade Center dust, an international team of scientists find an advanced form of highly energetic nanothermite composites. What is it, and where does it come from?
My name is Niels Harriet. I have a master and a PhD in chemistry, and I'm associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, and I have been so for almost 40 years. I have published close to 60 peer-reviewed papers in the best journals, and currently I'm involved with research X-ray time resolved spectroscopy on time scales of 1/millionth of a second. In the dust we found what we characterize as unreacted thermitic material in the shape of some very tiny red-gray chips, which have different properties. Most importantly is they're still reacting, some of them, and in the reaction they produce molten iron, which is the prime indication of a thermitic reaction, and such a reaction can be used to destroy steel structures. What we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite, which is produced in a different way. It is not just 2 powders being mixed. The material is actually built from the atom scale up. We call it the bottom-up procedure, which is what you do in nanotechnology. This has 2 consequences for the nanothermite, which distinguishes it from the classical thermite. First, the ingredients are much smaller, which means they're reacting faster and they are more easily ignited.
Stephen Jones, a physicist. I received my PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University in 1978, so I've been at this for over 30 years, studying various subjects. I have published over 50 peer-reviewed papers in my career. The primary elements in the red material are aluminum, iron oxide, as well as silicon and carbon. The iron oxide appears in faceted grains, approximately 100 nanometers across. The aluminum appears in thin platelets, about 40 nanometers thick. It is the small size of the particles involved in this material that allow us to characterize it as nanothermite. In ordinary thermite, the particle size is much larger, and hence ordinary thermite is an incendiary. Whereas as the particle size becomes smaller and smaller, it can become explosive. Superthermite is sometimes called. This red material contains also a significant amount of carbon, and the formulation of nanothermite as described by National Laboratory Publications also implies the presence of carbon, very typically. The organic is used with nanothermite in order to produce gas, that is a very high pressure gas that makes the nanothermite an explosive. We do have descriptions from the Livermore National Laboratory in particular of how they fabricated this material, but to fabricate it is not so easy. This is discussed in our paper in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, published in April of 2009. So far, none of these papers have been refuted in the literature, the scientific literature. So that means they are unchallenged in the scientific sense. They stand as an indictment, really, of the official story of 9/11.
One of the things I'd like to stress about these chips is that they really shouldn't be there. They're not a natural formed agglomeration of aluminum from the aircraft or materials that were in the building and iron oxide that got knocked off. It isn't just a haphazard bringing together of iron oxide and aluminum, which is the basic components of thermite. This is a material that is made up of nano-sized particles that are all very uniform, very symmetrical.
My name is Jason Cheshire, and I'm a licensed professional engineer in the province of Ontario in Canada. And I have been working in the field of hydrometallurgy for the past 10 years for a major company here in Canada. This is material that is of military use that really shouldn't be there.
My name is Roland Angle. I'm a civil engineer registered in the state of California. I've been practicing in California since 1967. I'm a graduate of the University of California. And my practice has included, among other things, design and testing of structures that were designed to withstand blasts. Specifically, for instance, the launch facilities for the Minuteman missile system. I was a Green Beret for 6 years during the 60s. I was trained in the use of demolitions, and I blew a lot of things up. Well, the American Society of Civil Engineers was brought into this investigation early on. They did a very superficial investigation of the site. They issued a report without any significant forensic examination, and there were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing.
I'm Tony Zambodi. I'm a mechanical engineer from the Philadelphia area with over 20 years of experience in the aerospace industry, where I design structures for aircraft and spacecraft and support equipment. Neither NIST or FEMA followed standard protocol for fire and explosion investigations, or just fire investigations for that matter. National Fire Protection Association Guide number 921 calls for saving the evidence and being prepared to justify why you wouldn't. It also calls for testing for accelerants and explosives when high-order damage is involved. NIST did not do this.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence.
There's national standards that need to be followed. And when I started looking into that, I went into the investigation manual. And so it's called the NFPA 921, and it's the fire and explosion. It's the guide for fire and explosions investigations. And so what it is, it's a national standard. So if an investigator from New York has to come out to the West Coast to help with something, they can fit right in seamlessly into the system and know what their role is and what they need to be doing. And so I went and I got the manual from 2001, and I went back and I looked at the footage from the original days of 9/11. There were all kinds of firefighters and civilians that were reporting explosions.
Okay, all right. Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Just the blatant destruction of evidence. We're not talking about a little bit of evidence. They destroyed all the steel, basically the bones of the building that would have told us how this first high-rise steel structure in history that hadn't been struck by an airplane, all it had was a few fires on several floors, and it had only been burning for a few hours. We've had other high-rises burn much longer. This was the way we could have learned from this, was analyzing that, looking at the steel and seeing how this collapsed and how it failed and which steel members did what. Well, we can't do that, because what they did immediately after 9/11 was they started removing the steel, the debris from Tower 7 and all the towers immediately. Why were they destroying this? I mean, they sent it off to China to be recycled. So they never had any physical evidence to do the investigation. The national standards are very clear. We have preservation of evidence, we have spoliation of evidence, there's all kinds of basically standards that you don't destroy evidence. Just the fact that there were explosions means they need to be investigated. So the manual gets into thermite, and if it says if you have melted steel or concrete, which we had on 9/11, and there's videos of it, people can see it, we should test for it. It says when you have melted steel or concrete, you test for thermite. So the fact that they're not testing for it is crazy. We had 3,000, Americans murdered, and we had the first 3 high-rise and steel collapses. We have all these reports of explosions. We have the vans pulled over. We have the history of terrorists using explosives. It's absolutely ridiculous that there's no excuse for it. It's criminal, in my opinion. It's absolutely criminal that they refuse to follow the national standards, and the national standards say that they should be testing that for explosives.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
Any honest investigator would be looking at this and looking for explosives and so forth. The NIST investigation didn't go there. They just would not look for explosives. There have been explosives found in the dust and the debris, but this has been the work of independent researchers, not NIST.
And I'd like to know why NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel. Well, why is this not included? Why is this forensic evidence not being included in the report?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava
from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
My name is Jeff Fair. I have a PhD in material science and engineering from the University of Minnesota. I have a BA in physics from Brigham Young University. I've worked with solid-state reactions. I've worked characterizing materials, semiconductor materials, thin films. I currently do a lot of work with nanoparticles as well as solid-state reactions. So Jonathan Barnett's study, which I thought was very well done and quite extensive, is all documented by FEMA in Appendix C in their BPAT report that was May of 2002. Unfortunately, it was never used in the NIST report. The next question is how do you get the sulfur in these pieces of steel or in the debris, and that question is unanswered.
We do not know which role is played by the red grade chips that we found in the dust. But we know, and this was already totally clear before we started investigating the dust, that both explosives and incendiaries were used in the controlled demolition of World Trade Center. This is quite obvious because of other observations. The molten iron and other findings in the dust.
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science is a way of finding out that is self-correcting and involves many people. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism. The thing that's most important about science is that it's a way of knowing, and it's a way of knowing that anyone can participate in. At the end of any kind of science activity, people will agree that they have collected evidence that illustrates a hypothesis, and if the evidence is contradictory to the hypothesis, one has to abandon that hypothesis and look for another one.
I'm Dr. Bob Bowman, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force, retired. Flew 101 combat missions in Vietnam, directed all the Star Wars programs under Presidents Ford and Carter. My PhD is in aeronautics and nuclear engineering from Caltech. I did postdoctoral work at the Von Karman Institute in Brussels, Belgium, in finite element analysis. I taught at 5 universities and colleges, serving as department head and assistant dean. The coup de grace for me was when I found out that Building 7 had collapsed later that day, and when I saw Building 7 come down. To me, Building 7, the fact that it looks like a perfect controlled demolition of an intact building with no visible fires. I mean, that's what I call a smoking gun.
I hadn't really given this much thought. But in the next day or two, I sat down at my computer and started searching, and I found there's quite a lot of research that had been done. In particular, the collapse of World Trade Center 7, which until that time, spring of 2005, I had not even seen the collapse of World Trade Center 7. It's a building that was not even hit by a jet.
Building 7 ablaze at the moment and apparently getting ready to collapse.
How can this be? That comes straight down completely and onto its footprint, never hit by a jet. How could this be?
And then late afternoon, still another building collapses. 7 World Trade Center.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned, this is not science. So the claim is that it's something else. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
I mean, do we just pull some idea out of the blue and say, well, this is how it happened? No. We say, no, I want to see data. I want you to explain to me how your explanation fits the data. And if it doesn't fit the data, I'm going to throw it out. I'm a scientist. That's what I do. Not because it's politically correct or incorrect. I don't care about that. Your explanation has to fit the data. That's what I like, data and correspondence with explanations.
I'm David Chandler. I have a bachelor's degree in physics from Harvey Mudd College and a master's in education from Claremont Graduate University and another master's in mathematics from California Polytechnic University. I've been teaching for over 30 years. It took some kind of consciousness raising on my part before I was willing to look at the possibilities. And really, you need to go where the evidence leads.
I reconstruct the past, natural history, from clues taken to be representational, and that's exactly what we're doing with reconstructing of why the buildings were destroyed in 9/11. In historical science, that's what must be done.
How do you respond to people that might say, this is just so far-fetched, it can't possibly be true?
Well, see, again, that argument is very general, far-fetched. I mean, I'm giving solid, concrete evidence. This is state-of-the-art equipment here. You know, if you can give me an argument why, what, is the scanning electron microscope, is that far-fetched? No. Is EDS far-fetched? It's used worldwide, and no, it's not far-fetched. So what's far-fetched? You know what? Tell me, is this far-fetched to make comparisons between residues from thermite and residues found in the World Trade Center? No, that's just science.
We know we've been lied to about 9/11. We don't know for sure who did it. We don't know exactly how they did everything. And that's why we need a new investigation to find out. But in the meantime, there are things we do know. We do know that there was a massive cover-up, that there was evidence hidden and destroyed.